There is a moment in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene that has no parallel anywhere in the canonical Bible. Jesus has just died. The disciples are in a room together, terrified, grieving, paralyzed. They have watched their teacher be arrested, tortured, and executed by the most powerful empire on earth. And now, according to this text, they are sitting in the dark, asking the question that would define the next 2,000 years of human history: what do we do now? It is Mary who speaks first, not Peter, not John, not any of the 12 apostles whose names you were taught in Sunday school. Mary Magdalene stands up in that room and tells the disciples that Jesus appeared to her after the resurrection and gave her private teachings, a vision, a revelation, a direct transmission of knowledge that he did not give to anyone else. And then she shares what he told her. And then Andrew says he doesn't believe her. And then Peter says something that the church spent 2,000 years pretending wasn't in the historical record. Did he really speak with a woman in private, without our knowledge? Are we to turn around and listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? And Mary begins to weep. That scene, that specific, uncomfortable, politically charged scene, is why this gospel was buried. Not because Mary's account was theologically implausible, not because the document was proven to be inauthentic, but because what it depicted was a direct challenge to the power structure that institutional Christianity was in the process of building. And the men building that structure understood exactly what was at stake if this particular document was allowed to survive. This is the story of what Mary Magdalene actually knew, what the Gospel of Mary actually contains. Why was it suppressed? And why the suppression tells you more about the origins of Christianity than almost anything else in the historical record. Before we go any further, we need to clear away 2,000 years of deliberate distortion, because what most people think they know about Mary Magdalene is almost entirely a fabrication. In 591 AD, Pope Gregory I delivered a sermon in which he identified Mary Magdalene, the woman who followed Jesus, who was present at the crucifixion, who was the first witness to the resurrection according to all 4 canonical Gospels, with the unnamed sinful woman in Luke 7 who washed Jesus' feet with her hair. Gregory called her a prostitute. He stated this as fact from the pulpit of the most powerful religious institution in the Western world. There is not a single word in any Gospel, canonical or Gnostic, that identifies Mary Magdalene as a prostitute. The identification was entirely Gregory's invention, a conflation of 3 separate women in the New Testament that had no textual basis whatsoever. Even the Catholic Church eventually acknowledged this. In 1969, the Vatican quietly revised its liturgical calendar and separated the 3 figures Gregory had merged. In 2016, Pope Francis elevated Mary Magdalene's feast day to the same rank as the male apostles, a tacit admission that she had been one of them all along. But by 1969, the damage was 13 centuries old. The image of Mary as a reformed prostitute, as a woman whose significance derived from her sin and her repentance, rather than from her spiritual knowledge and her relationship with Jesus, had embedded itself so deeply into Western culture that the correction barely registered. That was not an accident. The prostitute narrative served a precise institutional function. It transformed the most spiritually significant woman in the Jesus movement into a figure whose authority could be safely dismissed. You cannot be the primary recipient of post-resurrection teachings if you are primarily known as a sinner who needed saving. The slander did not just damage Mary's reputation, it destroyed her theological standing. And that is exactly what it was designed to do. So who was Mary Magdalene actually? The historical picture, assembled from both canonical and non-canonical sources, is remarkably consistent and remarkably different from the prostitute narrative. Mary of Magdala was from a prosperous fishing town on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. She was financially independent, Luke 8:3 identifies her as one of several women who supported Jesus' ministry out of their own resources, which implies significant personal means. She was present throughout Jesus' ministry in a way that most of the 12 apostles were not. When the male disciples fled at the arrest in Gethsemane, Mary stayed. She was at the crucifixion. She was at the tomb. And in all 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, she is either the first or among the first to encounter the risen Jesus. John's Gospel is the most intimate. In John 20, Mary is alone at the tomb, weeping, when she turns and sees a figure she initially mistakes for the gardener. When he speaks her name, Test, Mary, she recognizes him immediately. The Greek word she uses in response, Rabboni, means not just teacher but my teacher, personal, intimate, specific. This is not a generic disciple encountering a generic risen figure. This is a specific relationship, described with a specificity that the text does not apply to any male disciple. In the non-canonical tradition, Mary's significance is even more pronounced. In the Gospel of Philip, she is described as Jesus's koinonos, a Greek word that means companion, partner, or consort, depending on context, and which has generated enormous scholarly debate about the nature of their relationship. In the Pistis Sophia, a longer Gnostic text, Mary speaks more than all the other disciples combined, and is explicitly praised by Jesus as the one who understands his teachings most completely. And in the Gospel of Mary, she is something no woman is in the canonical Bible, the primary recipient of direct post-resurrection revelation, the one Jesus trusted most, the one he chose to transmit his most important teachings to, the apostle to the apostles, a title that even some early Orthodox writers reluctantly acknowledged. This is the woman the Church turned into a prostitute. Now, here is where most documentaries and YouTube videos about Mary Magdalene stop. The prostitute narrative was a slander. The Church distorted her legacy. She was actually important, and her voice was suppressed because of misogyny. All of that is true. But it is the surface layer of this story. And if you stop there, you miss the thing that makes the Gospel of Mary genuinely dangerous. Not just to medieval church patriarchy, but to the entire architecture of Orthodox Christian theology, right down to its foundations. Because what Mary knew, what she claimed Jesus told her in that private vision, was not a message about gender equality or women's ordination. It was a cosmological teaching, a description of what actually happens to the soul after death, a map of the levels of reality that consciousness has to navigate on its way back to the true God. And that map described a universe that the Orthodox Church could not afford to let people read. The Gospel of Mary survives in 2 fragmentary versions, a Greek fragment dating to the early 3rd century and a longer Coptic version found in Cairo in 1896. Even in its incomplete state, what it contains is extraordinary. After the resurrection, Mary tells the disciples that Jesus appeared to her in a vision, and she asked him, "How does someone who sees a vision actually see it? Through the soul or through the spirit?" It is a precise, technical, philosophically sophisticated question, not the question of a reformed prostitute, the question of someone who has been deeply engaged with the nature of consciousness and spiritual perception. Jesus' answer in the text is equally sophisticated. He tells her that vision happens neither through soul nor spirit, but through the mind. The nous, in Greek, the deepest faculty of human consciousness, the one capable of direct contact with divine reality. He is describing a form of knowing that bypasses both emotional intuition and rational analysis, a direct perception that the Gnostics called gnosis. Then Mary describes the vision itself, the soul's ascent through layers of reality, encountering powers at each level that attempt to hold it back, challenge its identity, convince it that it belongs to them and not to the divine source it is trying to reach. These powers, which map directly onto the Gnostic concept of archons, interrogate the ascending soul at each threshold. And the soul that has true knowledge, that knows what it actually is, passes through each threshold by demonstrating that it cannot be claimed by any of them. The text is damaged and fragmentary. Key sections are missing. But what survives is enough to understand why it was suppressed, because it describes a post-death journey that requires no priest, no sacrament, no institutional mediation of any kind. The soul that knows itself passes through every barrier on its own authority. The soul that has been kept ignorant, kept dependent on external systems for its spiritual identity, does not. This is not a peripheral teaching. This is a direct description of what salvation actually means in the Gnostic framework, and it locates the entire mechanism of salvation inside the individual human being, with no role for the Church whatsoever. The apostles in the room did not reject Mary's account because they found it spiritually unimpressive. They rejected it because of what it implied about everything they were building. The confrontation between Mary and Peter in this gospel is one of the most revealing documents in all of early Christian history, not because of what the characters say, but because of what the conflict tells us about the fault lines that were tearing early Christianity apart. Peter's objection to Mary is not theological. He does not say her account is cosmologically incorrect, or that her description of the soul's ascent contradicts other teachings. He says, did he really speak privately with a woman without our knowledge? Did he prefer her to us? That is a question about authority, not truth. Peter is not asking whether Mary's teaching is accurate. He is asking whether she has the right to teach it, whether her access to Jesus was legitimate, whether her gender disqualifies her from the position her knowledge actually entitles her to. This is the same Peter who Matthew's Gospel records Jesus calling the rock on which he would build his church. The same Peter whose authority Irenaeus and every bishop after him invoked as the foundation of apostolic succession. The same Peter who, in this Gospel, dismisses the most spiritually advanced disciple in the room because she is a woman. Levi, another disciple, intervenes on Mary's behalf. He tells Peter, "You have always been hot-tempered. Now I see you contending against the woman like the adversaries. But if the Saviour made her worthy, who are you to reject her? Surely the Saviour knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us." The text ends there. We do not know what happened next. The manuscript is damaged. The resolution, if there was one, is lost. But we know what happened historically. Peter's version won. Mary's version was buried, literally, in the case of the Nag Hammadi and Berlin Codex manuscripts. The church that Peter's authority founded spent the next 15 centuries calling the woman who knew more than him a prostitute. And the teaching she carried, the map of the soul's ascent, the description of direct interior liberation, the knowledge that required no institution to transmit, was ordered destroyed, along with every other text that threatened the monopoly on spiritual authority that the Orthodox bishops were constructing. Here is the part of this story that nobody asks out loud, but that sits underneath all of it like a fault line. If Mary Magdalene was the primary recipient of Jesus' most important post-resurrection teachings, and both the canonical Gospels and multiple non-canonical sources suggest she was, then the suppression of her Gospel was not just the erasure of a woman's voice. It was the suppression of the actual content of what Jesus most wanted to transmit. Think about what that means. The Christianity that shaped Western civilization, that built the cathedrals, conducted the Crusades, produced the Inquisition, ran the residential schools, shaped the moral frameworks that billions of people still live inside today, was constructed specifically around the teachings that Jesus gave to the male disciples. The ones who fled at Gethsemane, the ones who locked themselves in a room after the crucifixion, the ones who, when a woman stood up and said, "I have something to tell you, something he showed me that he didn't show anyone else," responded with suspicion, dismissal, and an argument about whether she deserved to be heard. The teaching that survived is the one Peter was comfortable with. The teaching that was buried is the one that made him angry. That is not a neutral theological fact. That is a civilizational choice, made not by God, not by history, not by the organic consensus of early Christian communities, but by specific men with specific institutional interests who understood exactly what they were doing when they decided whose account of Jesus counted and whose did not. And the reason this matters in 2026, the reason you are watching a video about a fragmentary manuscript discovered in Cairo in 1896, is not because the history is interesting, though it is. It is because the same mechanism is still operating. Every system that tells you your access to ultimate reality must be mediated by an external authority. Every institution that says you need them to tell you what is true, what is sacred, what counts as genuine spiritual experience, is running the same logic Peter ran in that room. Your interior experience is not legitimate on its own authority. You need us to validate it. Without us, you are just a woman weeping at a tomb, seeing things nobody else can confirm, claiming a knowledge nobody authorized you to have. The Gnostic Gospels, all of them, but the Gospel of Mary most precisely, exist to tell you that the authority being demanded from you is not spiritually real. It was constructed. It was constructed by specific people for specific reasons, and the woman who knew more than all of them was silenced so that the construction could proceed without interruption. There is one more thing that needs to be said about this gospel, something that gets lost in the historical and political analysis, important as that analysis is. The Gospel of Mary is not primarily a political document. It is a spiritual one, and the spiritual teaching at its center, the soul's ascent through the levels of reality, the recognition of the self that cannot be claimed by any archonic power, is not merely an interesting ancient cosmology. It is a description of something that human beings across every culture and every era have reported as a direct interior experience. The mystic traditions of Sufism, of Jewish Kabbalah, of Christian contemplative practice, of Hindu Vedanta, of Buddhist insight meditation, they describe, in radically different vocabularies, the same basic movement. The movement from the surface of the self that is constructed from external identities, social roles, institutional memberships, cultural programming, towards something underneath it that is none of those things. Something that was there before the programming began. Something that, once encountered, cannot be claimed by any power in this world. The Gnostics called it the divine spark. The mystics call it by 100 different names. And the one thing all of these traditions agree on is that it cannot be given to you by an institution, and it cannot be taken from you by one either. Mary knew this. She knew it with a precision and an intimacy that the disciples who had spent 3 years walking with Jesus apparently did not. And what she knew was suppressed, not because it was false, but because it was true in a way that threatened every structure built on the premise that spiritual authority belongs to the institution rather than to the individual who has actually encountered the divine. The manuscript that contains her teaching was discovered in Cairo in 1896. It sat in a German museum, largely ignored for decades. The first scholarly translation was not published until 1955. The first widely accessible English translation for general readers did not appear until 1998. That is 102 years between discovery and accessibility. The burning campaigns of the 4th century did not fully succeed. But the instinct behind them, the instinct to control what people can access, to delay and restrict and limit the circulation of ideas that threaten institutional authority, did not die with the Roman Empire. It simply found more bureaucratic forms. In the end, what the Gospel of Mary Magdalene offers is not a new religion. It does not ask you to replace one set of beliefs with another, one institutional loyalty with a different one. It does not even ask you to accept its cosmological framework as literally true. What it offers is a question. The same question the Gnostic tradition has always offered, in every text, in every teaching, across every century it has managed to survive. What do you actually know? not what you have been told, not what you have been authorized to believe, not what the institution you were born into has decided counts as legitimate spiritual experience, but what you know, directly, personally, in the interior of your own consciousness, in the moments when the noise goes quiet and something underneath it becomes briefly visible. Mary Magdalene stood up in a room full of frightened men and said, "I have something to tell you." Something, he showed me. Something about what we are and where we are going, and what none of the powers of this world can actually take from us. Peter asked whether she deserved to be heard. The text does not record her answer to that question, but she is the reason this video exists. She is the reason the Gnostic tradition survived at all, carried by communities that recognized in her account something that the official version of Christianity could never quite satisfy. The recognition that the thing you are looking for is not outside you, it has never been outside you, and no authority on earth has the right to tell you otherwise. Thomas saying 3, which the Gnostics read alongside her gospel, "The kingdom is inside you and it is outside you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known. But if you will not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and you are the poverty." Mary knew herself. That is what they buried. That is what survived. The secret book of John, the text that names the God of Genesis as the demiurge and describes the full architecture of the prison, is the deepest rabbit hole in all of Gnostic literature. That video is next. Subscribe,